One of them had already been in a courtroom for what he did to a child. The court knew. They gave him probation. Then he moved in with a single mom and her 2 little girls. The youngest was 5 months old. One of them parked his car down the street before sunrise, put on clear plastic gloves, and slipped a steak knife into his pocket. When her 18-year-old son aimed a rifle at him, the gun misfired. And one of them walked into a pawn shop and killed a man whose voice sounded so much like Elvis Presley's that people believed the king was still alive. He's been on death row for 26 years. And the day before his execution, a judge made a decision that changed everything. These are the executions of June 2026. Their crimes, their last meals, and their last words. But first, let us know where you are watching this from. On June 2, 2026, after spending 30 years on death row, Andrew Richard Lukehart was executed in Florida. And the reason he ended up there? It was something that should never have been possible. A year before he ever met Gabrielle, Andrew had already been in a courtroom for hurting a baby, a different one. The court knew, and they let him walk out with probation. So when a single mom needed someone she could trust around her 2 little girls, the man living under her roof was someone the state had already caught once. The youngest was 5 months old. She was out of time before she could walk, while Andrew got 30 more years. The first baby's name was Jillian. She was 8 months old. Andrew shook her so hard she ended up with broken bones, internal bleeding, and a head injury that left her with seizures and damaged vision. He pleaded guilty to felony child abuse and walked out with probation. And while he was still on it, he moved in with a woman named Misty Rue and her 2 little girls at 10502 Epson Lane in Jacksonville. The youngest was a baby named Gabrielle Hanshaw. This is what happened to her. It was February 25, 1996, a Sunday. Nothing about the day felt wrong. The family had spent the afternoon running errands together, all 4 of them in Misty's car, Andrew in the passenger seat, and the 2 girls in the back. They came home. Misty's father headed out to play golf, and Misty carried Ashley, her 2-year-old, into the bedroom for a nap. Ashley had been sick all day, clingy and fussy, and Misty wanted to stay close to her. So Andrew offered to watch the baby. For a while, everything was quiet. Then Andrew came into the bedroom and grabbed a clean diaper. He said he was going to change Gabrielle. Misty told him the wipes were in the den. He took the diaper and the baby, and he walked out of the room. That was the last time Misty ever saw her daughter alive. Then, around 5 o'clock, something changed. Misty heard a car door slam in the driveway. Then, the engine. She went to the window and saw Andrew behind the wheel of her white Oldsmobile, already pulling away. She ran for the garage, but he was gone. She ran back inside and searched the house, room by room. The baby was nowhere, and the cigarettes they always kept on the table in the garage, his and hers, were gone. For 30 minutes, Misty stood in that house alone. No baby, no car, no explanation. Then the phone rang. It was Andrew calling from a convenience store on Normandy Boulevard, and he sounded like a man falling apart. He told Misty to call 911. He said that while he stepped outside for a moment, a man in a blue Chevy Blazer had walked into the house and taken Gabrielle, just grabbed her and drove off. He said he tried to chase the Blazer, but lost it. And then his voice cracked, and he told her that if anything happened to that baby, he was going to kill himself. Misty called 911, and within minutes, deputies arrived at the house. A helicopter was in the air over Jacksonville. Search teams spread out across the area looking for a blue Blazer that, as it turned out, did not exist. Because later that night, Andrew would change the story. He would tell a detective the baby wasn't taken from the house at all. She was taken from the car at the convenience store. A completely different version, and the search had barely even started. Miles away in rural Clay County, a Florida Highway Patrol trooper named Richard Davis was standing outside his house when he heard that helicopter overhead. He called in to ask what was going on and was told a baby had been taken. While he was on the phone, a man came walking out of the dark with no shirt and no shoes, through a ditch across the trooper's yard with his hands in the air. That man was Andrew. He said, "I'm the one they are looking for." Richard asked him where the baby was, and Andrew looked at him and said, "I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Read me my rights." About a block away from Richard's house, they found Misty's car. Off the road, the engine still running, the doors unlocked, but no baby inside, no car seat, nothing. What followed was one of the strangest nights in the history of that county. Andrew wasn't under arrest. Nobody had enough to hold him, so they kept him in handcuffs for his own protection and let him talk. And he talked. But every time someone pushed back on a detail, a new version appeared. At one point, standing by the patrol car, Andrew said something to a deputy that nobody knew what to do with. Almost to himself, he said, "I wish he hadn't messed in her diaper." By the next morning, the search had been going for 18 hours. Dogs, ATVs, divers, all looking for a blue blazer that didn't exist. Then a local detective sat down with Andrew in the front seat of a parked car. Someone passed a photograph of Gabrielle through the window. When Andrew glanced at it, he turned away fast and said he didn't want to see it. The detective asked him plainly whether he had hurt the baby. Andrew went quiet. Then he said the baby was in Duval County. He gave directions to a pond off Normandy Boulevard, out in a rural stretch where no one would think to look. When they got there, he wanted to get out and pull her body from the water himself. The detectives told him no. And there she was, Gabrielle Hanshaw, floating in a shallow pond, still wearing the same dirty diaper Andrew swore he had been in the middle of changing. He had first told Jim that he waded in and laid her gently on her back. But later, back at the county jail, he admitted that wasn't true either. He threw her. He threw her body into a pond, and then drove to a phone and called her mother to say someone had kidnapped her. When the case went to trial, the body told the real story, and it did not sound anything like any version Andrew had ever given. The medical examiner, Dr. Floro, took the stand and walked the jury through what she found. Fresh bruises on Gabrielle's tiny hand and arm from just before she died. 5 separate bruises across her skull, and underneath, 2 fractures in 2 different spots, each caused by its own blow. These were not from a fall. These were not from a diaper change gone wrong. And when the prosecutor asked how much force it takes to fracture a skull, the doctor answered in a way no one in that courtroom forgot. "If you use your fist," she said, "it will be that force that you need to fracture the skull." Then the prosecution turned to the diaper. Andrew's story rested on the idea that Gabrielle died while he was changing her.
I got scared and I started to panic, and I ran outside and threw the diaper away and jumped in the car and started up and left. I felt bad. I felt guilty.
But a technician had found a clean, open diaper sitting in the playpen, untouched, and Gabrielle was pulled from that pond still wearing the dirty one. He never changed it. Every version he ever told was built on a lie. Andrew took the stand and admitted he was 6'1" and 225 pounds. He admitted he used force to push the baby down, over and over until she stopped moving. He admitted he had lied in every single version before this one. And when asked why he did any of it, all he had left was 6 words. "I felt bad. I felt guilty." The jury was out for an hour and a half, and they came back with guilty verdicts on both counts. Then came the penalty phase, and this is where the jury finally heard about Jillian, the first baby. Everything Andrew had already done before Gabrielle. The shaking, the head injury, seizures, and lasting damage to her vision. The guilty plea, and the fact that on the day Gabrielle died, Andrew was still on probation for it. Still technically under the court's watch. The facts said it clearly enough. The system caught him once, let him walk, and a second baby paid for it. The defense brought in a psychologist who described Andrew's childhood as a cycle of violence and substance abuse from age 4. They said he had an IQ of 79 and a condition that made him snap without warning. The judge listened. He gave some of it weight. The jury came back with a vote of 9-3 for death.
By a vote of 9-3, advise and recommend to the court that it impose the death penalty upon Andrew Richard Lukehart.
Andrew sat perfectly still. The judge sentenced Andrew to death. After the verdict, a reporter caught Andrew on the courthouse steps and asked if he was scared. He wasn't.
No, I'm not scared.
Why not?
I'm right with God, that's why.
For 30 years, he filed appeal after appeal. Every single one was denied. When the death warrant was signed, his lawyers argued the lethal injection would cause him extra suffering because of his kidney disease. Someone ended up in a pond, and 30 years later, the man who put her there asked to be protected from pain. The Florida Supreme Court said no. On June 2nd, that warrant was carried out. Andrew woke up at 5:15 that morning, his last morning. According to a Department of Corrections spokesman, he was calm and compliant from the moment he opened his eyes. He was allowed to request a final meal, but he declined. He had no visitors. Not a single person came to see him. The only one he met with was a spiritual advisor. At 6 o'clock that evening, the curtain of the execution chamber went up. Andrew was already strapped to the table, an IV in his arm. A priest sat at the foot of the gurney, praying over him as he lay there. The warden asked Andrew if he had any final words. Andrew raised his head. He looked at the front row of the viewing area, where Misty was sitting, and he said, "I'm sorry." Then he recited a Bible verse, Luke chapter 23, verse 34. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." It's what Jesus Christ said while he was being crucified. The drugs began to flow. Andrew lost consciousness almost immediately. A few minutes in, the warden shook him and shouted his name. There was no reaction. A medic was called in to check his vitals, and at 6:19 p.m., Andrew Richard Lukehart was pronounced dead. He was 53 years old. 3 weeks later, the next execution was carried out, also in Florida. And this case didn't start with a stranger. It started with a husband. On the morning of January 18, 1992, a man parked his car down the street from his wife's house before sunrise. He pulled on clear plastic gloves. He slipped a steak knife into his pocket, and he walked toward her front door while the neighborhood was still dark. What happened next was heard by Karen's 18-year-old son, Timothy, who grabbed a rifle from his mother's bedroom and ran outside. When he came around to the backyard, a man was on top of her, hitting her in the head with a brick. There was blood all over her face. Timothy aimed the rifle at the man on top of his mother and pulled the trigger. It misfired. So he swung the gun like a bat and cracked it across the man's skull so hard the rifle shattered on impact. But the man did not stop. By the time police arrived, Karen was dead in her own backyard. The medical examiner would later confirm that she had been alive and conscious for every single wound on her body. And the man responsible was Dusty Ray Spencer. But Dusty wasn't always the man investigators would come to know that day. Before he became a killer, Dusty was a United States Marine. He served as a lance corporal, trained as a rescue diver, and participated in rescue missions in the Philippines, where his job was pulling people out of the water and keeping them alive. That matters because years later, he would tell a friend over beers that he wanted to take his wife out on the boat and throw her overboard. The man who once saved lives in the ocean wanted to use it to take one. In the weeks before January 18, 1992, he had choked her, beaten her, threatened to kill her from a jail cell the morning after his arrest, and attacked both Karen and her 18-year-old son Timothy with a clothes iron, putting them both in the hospital. Karen had asked him to leave 3 separate times, but he kept coming back, and each time it got worse. In the end, it would cost her her life. Dusty was arrested that same day. A jury convicted him of first-degree murder and recommended death by a vote of 7-5. The judge agreed, calling the murder especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. Over the next 31 years, Dusty appealed to the Florida Supreme Court, the federal courts, and all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Every appeal was denied. By the time his execution date arrived, Dusty was 74 with liver disease and failing health. Dusty's spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, called the scheduled execution a nursing home execution. He described Dusty's skin as old and frail, saying it would need to be pulled tight just to run the IV. He wrote that no old man should die alone among strangers, and that there was already a death moving toward Dusty that the state did not need to rush, that they should let it come on its own time. He also said he understood that Karen's family would want to see Dusty executed, but that the real way to honor her memory was to quit killing people. In the days before June 25th, Dusty sent a message through his advisor to the public. "I want the people of Florida to know that I love God. I'm sorry for what I did, and no matter what happens, I'm going to be okay." Karen Spencer was not given the chance to be okay. She was never given 34 years to find peace, or a last meal, or a chance to say goodbye. She never got to tell anyone she was going to be okay. But Dusty did get all of those things, and then, on June 25th, 2026, his time finally ran out. That morning, Dusty woke up at 5:30 in his cell at Florida State Prison. According to a spokesman, he remained calm and compliant throughout the day. He got a visit from his spiritual advisor, and for his final meal, he requested a pizza, French fries, and a milkshake. At 6 p.m., the curtain to the death chamber went up. Dusty was already strapped to a metal table with an IV in his arm. His spiritual advisor sat at the foot of the gurney. When the warden asked if he had any last words, Dusty said, Sorry to the family. Into thy hands I commit my spirit and my soul. I'm on my way, Lord, I'm on my way. Amen." Immediately after his statement, the lethal drugs began flowing. After a few minutes of labored breathing, Dusty stopped moving. The warden shook him and shouted his name several times, but there was no response. A medic was called in to check his vital signs, and Dusty Ray Spencer was pronounced dead at 6:10 p.m. He was 74 years old and had spent more than half his life on death row. But June wasn't just about the men who were executed. There was a third man scheduled to die this month, and his execution was stopped the day before it was supposed to happen. Jeffery Lee walked into a pawn shop in Orrville, Alabama, asked a woman to show him the wedding rings, and told her he'd come back with money. He came back, but not with money. He came back with a sawed-off shotgun, and the man he killed wasn't just a pawn shop owner. Jimmy Ellis had a voice so close to Elvis Presley's that Sun Records signed him in the 1970s. He performed as Orion, wearing a mask. People bought his records wondering if Elvis was still alive. When the fame faded, he came home to Orrville and opened a pawn shop. Working alongside him was his ex-wife, Elaine Thompson. On the morning of December 12, 1998, Jeffrey was 21 years old and had been up all night on a binge of alcohol and drugs. He drove to the pawn shop with his brother and cousin. When Jeffrey walked in that morning, he spoke with an employee named Helen King. Helen showed him the wedding rings on display. He looked them over. Then he told her he didn't have money with him, but that he would come back after he got some from his grandmother. And then he left. Jeffrey and the two men with him drove a short distance from the pawn shop. Jeffrey bought a pint of liquor. He drank it. Then he smoked marijuana laced with cocaine. And then, minutes later, all three of them turned around and drove back. Around noon, Jeffrey walked through the front door of Jimmy's pawn shop for the second time that day. But this time, he was carrying a sawed-off shotgun. And right inside the entrance, there was a big television screen showing the store's surveillance feed. Anyone walking in could see themselves being recorded. Jeffrey looked at that screen, and then he yelled, "What's up, motherfucker?" and opened fire. He shot Jimmy first. The blast hit him in the chest. Then Jeffrey turned the gun on Elaine and shot her in the face. He then shot Helen, the same woman who had shown him the wedding rings just hours earlier. Then he walked back to Jimmy and shot him again. Jimmy died from the gunshot wound to his chest. Elaine died from the wound to her face. But Helen, who had been shot and was lying on the floor of the pawn shop, made a decision in that moment that saved her life. She lay completely still, didn't move, didn't make a sound. she played dead. Jeffery tried to take the cash register. He grabbed it, pulled at it, but it was wired to the counter. He couldn't get it free. And that was not it. He left $900 sitting in Jimmy's pocket. He didn't take any jewelry. He didn't take anything from the safe. He just left the shotgun sitting on the counter and walked out. Helen waited until she heard him leave. Then she got up off the floor, picked up the phone, called 911, and locked the doors to the store. And then Jeffery came back. He returned to the pawn shop and tried to re-enter. But Helen had already locked the door. He couldn't get in. 3 visits to that store in a single day. First for rings, then with a shotgun, then trying to get back inside after 2 people were already dead on the floor. And the entire thing was captured on the store's surveillance camera. Jeffery fled to Georgia with his brother and cousin, but they turned around, drove back to Alabama, and told law enforcement everything. Jeffery was arrested in a motel room at 4:30 a.m. He confessed, but claimed the first shot was accidental. The surveillance tape said otherwise. The trial lasted less than 2 days. Helen was alive to testify. The surveillance video showed everything, and the jury convicted Jeffery of 2 counts of capital murder. Jeffery spent 26 years on death row, with 0 violent infractions. A guard once told a visitor, "The man we're killing tonight is different from that young, brash animal that came in here. He's changed his life." And Jeffery himself said something that stuck. "When this crime happened, I didn't know their names. I didn't know until I was arraigned." Years later, he said something else. "Jeffery Lee today is not who he was 28 years ago. I'm more caring, more honest, more open, and I live in a way that honors life. Now I see life as being sacred. It means everything." But none of that mattered. In March 2026, his death warrant was signed. His execution was scheduled for June 11th. In an interview from death row before the execution date, Jeffery said, "I believe in God, and I haven't heard from him that June 11th is my last day on earth. I have to believe that." And he was right, because what would happen the day before his scheduled execution would change everything. On June 10th, a federal judge ruled that nitrogen gas was unconstitutional. Too cruel. The court found that it caused 1 to 3 minutes of discomfort before death. Jeffery's lawyers then proposed an alternative, a firing squad. The same man who shot 3 people inside a pawn shop was now asking the court to let the state shoot him because being suffocated was too cruel. But Alabama doesn't authorize firing squads. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no. But here's what most people don't know. The ruling only blocked nitrogen gas. Lethal injection was available. The electric chair was available. Nothing was stopping Alabama from using either one, but they chose not to. They let the execution window close. And Jeffery Lee stayed alive. After the ruling, Jeffery called from Holman Correctional Facility. He said, "It's like an expected sigh of relief in one aspect, and then you still got to stay and maintain your focus and continue to fight." As of today, he is 49 and still on death row, still sentenced to death. But no one can say when or if that sentence will ever be carried out. This concludes all executions carried out in June 2026. Subscribe if you want to see more cases like these, and tell us in the comments which case is still sitting in your head right now.